Cute. Does anybody in here like babies? Just anybody? Yeah? Oh, a lot of you. Wow. I have a couple babies at home as well. So I want to take you to this moment. Before I was a pastor, I was a physical therapist assistant, and we got to this point in our lives where I felt the need to bring more money in. Have you ever been there where you're like, oh shoot, I think I need some more money? And I was a physical therapist assistant, and so one of the things that you could do if you work in the medical field is you can work contingent, So I signed up for a lot of jobs that would call me if they needed me, right? And so I had a bunch of them. I had like 2 or 3. And because I took on so much work, what ended up happening was I would wake up at 5 in the morning and then go and do my regular job, my full-time job, and then I would go to sometimes 2 or 3 other places after that to just fulfill the commitments that I had made. And what ended up happening was that I'd wake up at 5 and then I'd come home at like 10 at night, and after a few months of this, it just became a lot, And I remember being just like so tired. On top of that, I tried to pick up Saturday hours as well, and so I was working 6 days a week, and I was a key volunteer at a different church at the time, and so I had stuff I had to do on Sundays, and so it just became a lot. And I remember this one night in particular. It was like 10 p.m., and I just finished up with my last patient, who I had convinced to wake up and do therapy with me. I clocked out, and I remember I was just feeling like so tired, And I worked up in Monroe, Michigan, and I knew that I had to drive back, and so I remember getting into my car, and it was really cold outside. It was in the middle of winter, and I remember thinking, I don't know. Like, am I okay to drive? I'm really tired. And I thought, I'm 2 minutes down the road from my other place. Maybe I could just sleep in the car tonight, and go to work. Then I don't know. I finally decided to go home, but I remember driving home and like my eyes feeling really tired, And I remember gripping the steering wheel because I couldn't hold my arms up because I was just tired, My whole body was just tired. And I made it home safely, thankfully, and I remember pulling in the driveway and coming into my house and having this overwhelming sense of, I never see this place, my wife had rearranged some furniture, and I was like, when did that happen? I haven't been home to see this. And I remember just having this overwhelming feeling of I'm so missing out on home. I had just had this daughter born. It was my firstborn, and she was probably 5, 6 months old. And, babies change a lot, in the first few months. And I remember thinking, I only see my daughter on Sundays. I leave before she wakes up. I come home after she's gone to bed, and I never see her. I remember standing in the kitchen, just putting my bag down, and I just started crying because I was so frustrated with the way my life was. And I remember I walked into my daughter's room and pulled her out of her crib, and she kind of half awake, and I laid on the floor, and I just put her on my chest, and I remember just starting to sob because the feeling of having her close to me was foreign. I haven't felt, I don't know what this feels like, And I must have caused some of commotion because my wife walked in, and she held my hand, and I remember we just kind of cried there. I don't know if you've ever had the feeling that you're missing it. Like something is going on that you need to be a part of, that you want to be a part of, that's a part of your hopes and dreams for your life, but somehow you're missing it. For me, missing it feels like not knowing what it's like to hold my daughter. For me, missing it is not knowing what's going on in my house. There's just, the furniture is different, and I didn't know. I wonder if you've ever missed it before. I wonder if you've ever had this point in your life where maybe you came to a fork in the road, where you can choose to do the right thing, where you can choose to follow God in your life, and you just chose the wrong path. You missed his call, his purpose in your life. What we're going to be talking about today is a story in which 4 guys miss it. More than 4, but we're going to look at the 4 guys who miss it, and 1 guy who gets it. And kind of what we're going to be focusing on is why they missed it. They're the kind of guys that you would think that wouldn't miss it. They're the kind of guys that shouldn't miss it. They're the kind of guys that should get it, but they don't. And I think so often this is true for us. And I kind of want to start with this, before we dive into that, I want to start with this concept that God is always moving. He's always moving into something better, and sometimes we miss it. God is always moving into something better, and sometimes we miss it. I don't know if you know this, but God has, we believe this as Christians a lot. You hear this said a lot. It's on coffee cups. God has plans for us, right? Like God has a future that he's willing to exist. And so every second of every moment of every day is moving into this future that he wills, into this future that he's already dreamed of, thought of, planned, and we're all moving. God is constantly moving us into this future. And it's not just that God is moving all of creation into a future, God is also moving in us. One of my favorite verses in the New Testament is 2 Corinthians 3:18. Paul talks about what transformation looks like. He talks about how we are transformed from one degree of glory to another. So here's what that means. In the Christian life, what we believe is that God is always moving in us. His Spirit dwells in us, and he's moving us to be transformed, to change from one degree of glory to another. And so the Spirit moves and breathes, and we change, and we change from one degree, and then it happens again, and we change into another degree. God is always moving in our souls. God's always moving, and he's always moving into something better. You know, I think in the current political climate and the current cultural climate that we're in, there's a lot of fear being sown out there because politicians want you to believe that everything is going to crap and they're the only ones who can fix it. Businesses are the same way. They want you to think that your life stinks, and if you buy their product, then it'll be better. And so what happens kind of collectively, just as a culture, if you were to study our culture right now, you would see that we're a very pessimistic people. We don't have much hope for the future. But what we believe in Christianity is that God has a future that he is planning. You know, have you ever prayed, thy will be done? You know, the Lord's Prayer. We pray for God's will to be done because we believe that his future, his options are better than our own. We want to move where he is moving because we believe that that's better. In the same way, when God changes us from one degree of glory to another, we're being made to look more like him. We're being made to be more united with him, to have a deeper relationship with him. We're moving into a future that is better. And sometimes we don't like the process of change to get to that future. Sometimes we can think like the future isn't good because I have to go through some pain in order to get there. It's kind of like going to the gym, you know? Does anybody here like going to the gym? Nobody, don't raise your hand. Nobody likes going to the gym, you know? I mean, you could tell, okay, so there's some weirdos who do, right? Let me give you a better one. Nobody wants to go to the dentist, right? Like the dentists, cats, and country music stars are trying to take over the world, and they're evil, and we need to stop them. That's just kind of what I think. Sorry if you're a cat fan. Not sorry if you're a country music fan. Anyway. Sometimes, like you understand, like going to the dentist is painful. We don't like it, but we know it's good for us, and so we do it anyway. Sometimes the change that God wants us to accomplish in our life is a painful change, and so it doesn't look like the future is better, but you have to know that God is calling us into a deeper relationship with him. He's calling us into a life that is more meaningful and purposeful. He's calling us into the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness. He's calling us into goodness. And so what you have to see is that fundamentally Christianity is a religion of hope. It's a religion that believes that the future is brighter than the present, that what will happen in the future is God's plan, and we pray for that because we know that that's what he wants, and we know that we want to do it with him. In Christianity, we believe that we're moving into a brighter future. So God is always moving. God is always moving. He's always moving into something better. So here's if I could give you the big idea for the message. God is always moving into something better, so don't miss it. So don't miss it. Do you know what it's like to miss it? Maybe you've come to that fork in the road where you know that God is calling you to live a life that is better, a life that leads to more love, a life that leads to more joy and peace. And maybe you've come to that fork in the road where you know you can take that path or you can live a life that's less. And so maybe you come to this choice where like God calls us to manage our money well. And so we come to this choice, especially like on Black Friday, where it's like, okay, I think I can afford this. No, I probably can't, but I know how I can. Here's a credit card. Anybody ever done that before? Not a good idea. And you come to this fork in the road where it's like, okay, I can ensure my long-term peace, or I can buy this now, and then you live a life of less. Or maybe you've come to this fork in the road where there's somebody in your life that needs your help. Somebody that maybe is annoying to you, but somebody that you can do something for. But instead, you choose to be stingy with grace. You choose to be stingy with your love, and you retreat and you hold back, and you begin to live this life that actually has less love, less peace, less joy, because you're not going with God into his better future. I want you to see that we have so many options throughout our day to move with God into a better future, and so often we miss it. We miss it. And maybe you can't like pinpoint a time in your life where you missed it, but maybe you're like in a season of less. Like maybe there was a time somewhere along the way when you made a choice, but you don't know when that was. But now you're living in a life that has less peace, less joy, less comfort, less goodness in it. And maybe you're like, I don't know where I went wrong, but somehow I'm just not living the good. My life isn't getting better. God is always moving into something better. And so I want to talk about how it is that we miss it. So we're going to be in this story that's in Mark chapter 14. And it's a story about how a bunch of guys miss it, and one guy gets it. And so my hope is that as we study how they missed it, that we would also see how we miss it. As we see how one guy gets it, that we would also figure out how we can get it, how we can move with God into his better future and choose life, choose joy, choose peace, instead of choosing a life of less. So we're going to pick this up in Mark chapter 14, verse 43. And immediately, while he was still speaking, that's Jesus, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now the betrayer, that's Judas, had given them a sign, saying, "The one who I will kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard." And when he came, he went up to him at once and said, "Rabbi," and he kissed him. And they laid hands on him and seized him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. In John, it says that was Peter. Peter cuts off the guy's ear, and then Jesus picks up the ear and puts it back on. That's just Jesus for you. Crazy stuff. And Jesus said to them, "Have you come out against me as a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled." And this is verse 50. I'm going to camp out in verse 50 here. And they all left him and fled. When I first read this passage, because I do some research for it to figure out what God wanted to say this morning, that last one, I just couldn't get over that last line. And they all left him and fled. They all left him. They, like the disciples, the ones who had spent 3 years with him, who had seen miracle after miracle after miracle, who had absorbed his teaching, who had face-to-face interactions with Jesus, they missed it. They got it wrong. They all left him and they fled. Some of them even, James and John, a lot of people believe that James and John were Jesus' cousins. And so they may have even known Jesus like way even before the other disciples, and they miss it. They get it wrong. And so we're asking the question this morning, how is it that they missed it? How is it that we miss it so that we can get it in the future? I want to give you the first reason why they missed it. The first one is this: they were overconfident. They were overconfident. We skipped this passage last week because I knew we would get to it this week. I want to read it to you. It's in Mark chapter 14, verse 26. Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper, and then this happens. It says, "And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives, and Jesus said to them, 'You will all fall away.'" You gotta love like Jesus' timing on stuff. He just walks in. They're all like huddled up. They're like, "Yeah, dinner was great." And Jesus walks in. "You're all gonna fall away." It's like context, Jesus. Maybe lead in. I don't know. Whatever. "You will all fall away. It is as it is written. I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." Jesus is saying, you're going to leave me, I'm going to die, I'm going to rise again, but don't worry, I'll meet you at the fishing boats where I first found you in Galilee. It'll be awesome. And Peter said to him, I love Peter, always the overconfident one. Peter says, "Even though they fall away, I will not." You gotta love Peter. Peter's like, those guys, Jesus, you're probably right about them. Like, I've spent some time with them. They're kind of weird, I don't think they're really in this. I'm in this, though, Jesus. Like me, I'm in this. You gotta just, see what Peter is saying here. Even though they fall away, I won't. And Jesus says to him, truly, I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But Peter responds, he said, emphatically, if I must die with you, I will not deny you. And they all said the same. And then you fast forward to verse 50, and it says, and they all left him and fled. Here's what I want you to see. In this little story that we just kind of read through, Peter is like, or Jesus says, hey, you're all going to leave me. And Peter's like, nuh-uh. And Jesus is like, yeah, huh? And Peter's like, nuh-uh. And Jesus, I don't do it. Peter's like, even if I have to die with you, I'm going to stay with you. And then literally 20 verses later, he leaves. I want you to see this, that Peter is a little overconfident. Now, here's another way to say it. Peter was arrogant. Peter was arrogant. Do you know what arrogance does? Arrogance tells you a lie. It tells you the lie that here's the lie it tells you, that you're so strong, that your strengths are so good that you don't have to worry about your weakness. It tells you that your strengths make you impervious to your weakness. And so all of a sudden you adopt this mindset that your bad habits, that your temptations, that the things you maybe struggle with, you don't got to worry about those. You know why? Because I'm good looking. Because I'm a smooth talker, because I'm a smart person, because I'm successful. Whatever it is that your strengths are, pride, arrogance tells you that because you have those things, you don't got to worry about this stuff over here. But here's the problem with that mindset. The problem with that mindset is this, that sin, when it's ignored, only grows. Sin, when it's ignored, only grows. I want to share this passage from Genesis. This is Cain and Abel. If you remember that story, Cain and Abel. Cain kills his brother Abel. But before he does that, in Genesis 4, Cain's really, really angry. And God comes to him and he gives him this warning. He says, if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Listen how God describes sin. It's crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. I want you to see how God's describing sin here. He says it's crouching at the door. God is using a literary device called personification. Personification is when you give an inanimate object qualities of a person. You could say, that rock was really loyal. Was the rock loyal? No, that's a personal thing, That's called personification. So here's what God is doing. He's saying, this is what sin is like. This is how you need to understand sin. It's crouching at the door. I have this irrational fear of cougars. Anybody with me on that? Afraid of cougars? Not the old lady kind. I used to work in a nursing home. That happens all the time. I have this irrational fear of cougars. I just read this the other week that there's two guys hiking in Washington, and this cougar, I'm afraid of cougars because they stalk you. You don't know they're there, and then they just jump out of nowhere and they kill you. It's not great. And so it's not the ideal situation when you're in cougar territory. And so I don't, I don't know, it's a weird thing that I fear. But I want you to see that God is saying that sin is it's like a wild animal. It's like a beast. It's crouching, it's prowling, it's ready to get you. So can you imagine what would happen if you adopted a mindset that told you that, yeah, it's crouching, but don't worry about it. It's just a kitten, It's just a little kitten. It's not going to get you. God's saying it's the exact opposite. You don't have to wonder what happened. In that story, Cain ends up killing his brother. His anger grows. His sin grows. It pounces, and then Cain commits the first murder. Sin, when you ignore it, it only grows. It gets bigger. It only gets more powerful. And here's why pride comes before a fall. Because you believe this, you adopt this mindset, you believe this phrase that your strengths make you impervious to your weakness. And so you ignore the bad stuff. You ignore your bad habits, your temptations, and all of a sudden they pounce and they get you. That's why pride comes before a fall. You can see this in Peter, right? Peter's like, even though they all fall away, I'm not going to. I got this, Jesus. Can you see the arrogance at work? He's saying no. I know myself. I'm strong. I know that when I say what I mean, but you can tell he's not even thinking about the future because 20 verses later, he runs. And so what I want us to see this morning is sometimes we get going on this path, this journey that we call the Christian life, And there's so many options on this path. We can choose to go with God into this better future in which we exhibit more love, which we live a life that has more peace and goodness in it. And so often we miss it. And one of the ways that we miss it is because we become overconfident. We think that we'll never miss that. I always take the right path. We allow arrogance to whisper that lie to us, that we're so strong, we're so good, we're such a good Christian, that we don't have to worry about the bad stuff. That's one reason why we miss it. Here's another one. They got Jesus wrong. They just got Jesus wrong. So we talk, Peter is kind of overconfident. Here's James and John. I want to take you back to the story in Mark chapter 10. Now, we're going back 4 chapters, but in the chronology of this is actually this event that I'm about to read. It happens a week before the betrayal in the garden, okay? So a week before this moment, this is what James and John, 2 of the disciples, this is what they're doing. This is chapter 10, verse 35. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." Have your kids ever said that to you? "Hey, I'm going to ask you a question. I want you to say yes." You're like, there's a red flag here. I don't know why, but I don't think this is going to work out. "We want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." Now, here's the thing. If you don't know first century Judaism, then what they're asking kind of goes over your head. So you might have been here a couple of months ago when we went through this passage, and you might remember this. That kind of what was going on at the time is that the Jews believed that the Messiah was going to come and rescue them from Roman oppression. They're going to rescue them from their overlords, and Jesus, or the Messiah, is going to come, and he's going to restore the reign and rule of Israel on the earth. And so I want you to see this. That a week before they all run away, the thing that James and John are thinking about Jesus is that he's not coming to save us from our sins. He's not coming to guarantee a deep and intimate relationship with the God of the universe. No, Jesus is coming to throw off Roman rule and to set up his throne here on earth. And so what they're asking is, hey, when you do that, can we sit at your right and your left, Like can we just sit there in front of everybody so they all know who we are? And so that when, when people take the pictures, we're right there. And when they take the pictures, I'm just going to give them my good side, like this, or like, That's what James and John are asking. They're saying, we want to be famous with you, Jesus. Now, put that mindset on. If you think that Jesus is there to bring about this earthly reign and rule, and then you go into this garden with Jesus late at night because he's stressed out, and you're like, whatever, Jesus, you're going to take over the world. Who cares? Like, chill out, bro. And you go to this garden, and he says, hey, sit here and pray, and you're tired, and you fall asleep, and then all of a sudden you wake up, and Jesus has been captured. Your military leader has been captured. Your general has been captured. All of a sudden, what are you thinking, right? Here's what I think you're thinking. Oh, whoops, I'm going to just go over here. Is there a tree over here? I'm just going to hide like this. That's what they're thinking. They're thinking that they just lost, that their hopes and dreams for the future have been crushed. And it's not just that. He's not even fighting. He's going with them willingly. I want you to see that they didn't get Jesus, and because they didn't get Jesus, it caused them to miss it. There's so many ways in Christianity that we kind of get it wrong when it comes to Jesus, that we miss it. There's some common beliefs that kind of force us to miss it when it comes to Jesus. Here's one of them. Jesus gets me stuff. There's a whole subsection of Christianity that believes that God is here to give us more wealth, that God is here to get us the promotion and the girl and the car, that God is here to make sure that I have a big house. And then what happens, though, is when you don't get it, what happens is you get this mindset where all of a sudden what you believed about God to be true isn't true. And then what happens is they always turn it in on themselves. And so what happens is they say, I didn't have enough faith. It's my fault. And so what develops is a life of less. You're not getting what you think you deserve. You're always working hard to get the good life, to have more goodness in your life. But the whole time you're not getting it, and so you just keep blaming. I wish I had more faith. I wish I had more faith. I wish I was better. I wish I was a better Christian. I wish I obeyed more. I wish I was just prayed more. I wish I read the Bible more. And you adopt this mindset that leads to a Christianity that is tired and fatigued, and it is you beat yourself up constantly. And it's all because you missed it. Over time, what ends up happening is you come to this place where you think, God, I've had faith. Like, I've done the right things. Why aren't you showing up? You're supposed to make my life better, and you become angry and bitter at God, all because way back here you missed it. Here's another belief that's out there that just doesn't quite get Jesus. Jesus makes sure you follow the rules. That's what Jesus is about. He's here to make sure that you follow the rules. If you have this mindset, then here's what it'll lead to. You'll always take the path of judgment and criticism. You'll always take the path of figuring out what others are doing wrong and what you're doing wrong. Because if you can figure out what you're doing wrong, then that means that you're not following Jesus. And you're supposed to, because that's what we believe, that Jesus is here to make me follow the rules. And then you become fearful of God because I'm doing the wrong thing, and he's going to send a lightning bolt, and he's going to fry me like fried chicken. I'm kind of hungry right now. That didn't make sense. You see that if we have this belief that Jesus makes sure we follow the rules, the God that you believe in is a God of retribution, of wrath, of anger. And what functionally, how that plays out in your life is you walk the path of less. Because when you mess up, you become fearful that God, you're like looking around, is God going to get me? And you start to beat yourself up. And you're like, oh man, I just wish that I was a better person. And all of a sudden, you load yourself with this guilt and shame, all the while misunderstanding God, misunderstanding the heart of God, misunderstanding that God's attitude towards sin is, I paid for that. I paid for that. You don't have to make yourself pay for that. I paid for that. You don't have to load yourself with that guilt and shame. I put that on myself. Let me have it. God's attitude towards sin and mistakes is one of which I'm fixing that problem. And if you believe that Jesus is here to make sure that you follow the rules, and if you don't follow the rules, he's going to get you, here's what that leads to. It actually leads to a life of more sin. Here's a quote by Charles Spurgeon. Charles Spurgeon is the Uber Baptist, so he's about as Baptist as you get. That's Charles Spurgeon. He says this: "When I thought God was hard, I found it easy to sin. But when I found God so kind, so good, so overflowing with compassion, I beat my breast to think that I ever could have rebelled against God is here to make you follow the rules. And he's going to get you if you don't." It actually leads to more sin. Because what happens in your brain is this. You think, well, I already messed up 6 times this morning. I can mess up one more. I'm already getting punished for this stuff. What's a little bit more? It leads to this mindset of, I'm already a mistake. I'm already a failure. Why not just keep failing? That's just who I am, right? But here's what Charles is saying. The moment of conversion for the Christian happens when you realize this, that God is so kind, so good, so overflowing with compassion. Because when you realize that, here's what happens. Something changes in your heart. All of a sudden, love springs up, appreciation, gratitude for that God. And those things are the things that fuel you to live a life of more, to go with God into the future, to go with God into a life that has more love and more peace and more joy. Most people, when you load them with guilt and shame and punishment, very often that this leads to a life that continues to get more guilt and shame and punishment. But the way you get free is by receiving the love of God. Can you see how if you have the wrong belief about God, if you miss it about Jesus, you're going to miss him on the journey that we call the Christian life? Because you'll get to this point where God calls you to love somebody, and you're like, but God, they messed up. I don't get it. What I believe about you is that you kill people who mess up, and now you're calling me to love on them? One of the classic stories about this is in the Old Testament is Jonah. I love the story of Jonah. Because Jonah, he runs away, he's getting in the fish, right? He's in the fish for 3 days, and the fish spits him out. But the whole reason he's running is because God says, hey, go to your enemies and tell them to repent. And Jonah says, God, if I do that, then they're gonna repent and you're gonna save them. And I don't wanna do that. Here's what I want you to see. Jonah is like, God, you're going into this future that is better, that has more love and more grace and more beauty and more freedom, but I don't want it for them because I think that you're a retributional God. You're a God who condemns. And because he can't reconcile those two things, he decides to run away. So many times I think as Christians, we come to this point in which we can spread love around, in which we can show love to those around us, in which we can take the love that God has given us and give it to those freely, to give it to the people around us, and we choose not to because we very often think the wrong things about God. And so here's the invitation this morning, that as we come to those places that we believe what's true about Jesus, that he gave himself for us, that he died, he sacrificed himself for us. That's how God looks at the people around you. Here's the last one. We've seen that they were overconfident. We've seen that that they didn't really get or understand Jesus. Here's the last one. They weren't quite on board. I want to show you, this is the story of Judas. So at some point, Judas gets on board with what Jesus is saying, right? Like Jesus is doing all these miracles in the Galilee. He's working all this beautiful stuff, and all these crowds are following him. At some point, we don't know when, but Judas comes up and he's like, oh, I want to do that too. That looks cool. So Judas is interested in Jesus' ministry at some point, but it fails to really change him. We see later, this is from John chapter 6, verse 70, says this about Judas. It says, Jesus answered them, did I not choose you, the 12? He's talking to the 12. Yet one of you is the devil. He's talking about Judas. He spoke of Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, for he, one of the 12, was going to betray him. I want you to see that Judas came with Jesus, but he was never really on board with Jesus. Like he said that he wanted to follow him, but he didn't make actual changes in his life. When I read this passage, when I kind of understand what Judas is doing here, the first thing that makes me think really is I do that all the time, Like I'll talk to people and I'll say, I really love Jesus and I want to follow him and I want to spread his love around. But when it comes to the point of action, when I'm actually supposed to do it, I often pull back because I don't like the person that I'm supposed to show love to, because I don't want to give them the time of day, because in my heart there's evil in there. And it makes me ask the question, what is it that I'm missing? How do I make this transition from valuing Jesus to actually making a change in my life? This week I was reading a book, and he talked about this educational psychologist named Benjamin Bloom. Benjamin Bloom set out to figure out why it is that organizations want to change, but they can't change. I want you to see, this is the fundamental question. I want to be more like Jesus, but at some level, I just don't do it. And why is that? And so he put together this system. Can we put that graphic on the screen? He said that change requires 5 things, okay? You have to be aware that you need a change, right? You can't make a change that you're not aware of. You have to think about the change. People think about this. Some people think less than others. Some people are, quick to action, but we all think about the change that we want to make. At some point, we begin to think, oh, yeah, I think I really do need to make this change. We value it. But he says that there's this thing that breaks down right here between step 3 and step 4, between valuing and prioritizing, and he called it the action gap. This is the point at which we go to make change, but we fail. It's the point at which we think, I want to do this, but we don't actually do it. And what he says is that what you need to do is move to prioritizing it in your life. Here's what this functionally means for us. And we're walking on the path that we call Christianity, this Christian life, and we come to this place where we can move with God into a better future, or we can choose a life of less. What we need to do is aware of it. We need to think about it. We need to value it. But then what you need to do is prioritize it in your life. You need to go to your schedule and actually make sure that you have time for it. You need to tell somebody around you and say, hey, hold me accountable to this, because I want to live a better life with Jesus. You have to prioritize it. And once you prioritize it, then you have to move to this other step called owning it. People who own stuff are CrossFitters. Anybody know any CrossFitters? Of course you know the CrossFitters because they're always talking about CrossFit, right? Or vegans. Y'all know about the vegans because Thanksgiving's next week, right? It's true. Here's the thing. Those people, they move from valuing to prioritizing. When the vegan goes to the store, they don't go to the meat section. Why? Because they're prioritizing. They've thought this through. If I'm going to make this change, then I shop in a different section. Or if I want to get more healthy, then I need to go to the gym 5 days a week. And they make this leap. They go through the action gap. They don't just value it, they prioritize it. And so for us, when we are going to make this change, when we're going to go with God into a better future, what that means is we have to functionally, just very practically, we have to put that in our schedule. We have to make these choices to make this change. And so that's Judas. I want to bring the band up. I want to kind of close with this idea. We've been saying all along that there is a bunch of guys in this passage who don't get it, and there's one guy who does. Do you know who the guy who does get it is? It's Jesus. I want you to see this. Where Peter, a couple verses earlier, is like, I'm never going to fail. I'm never going to leave you. where Jesus is overconfident, a few verses after that, Jesus is in the garden, face down on the ground, saying, God, I don't think I have what it takes to do this. Saying, God, I think the future that you're calling me to is too hard. And then he says this, probably the most humble thing you can say, yet not what I want, but what you want. Make me do what you want. I submit to you. And so we see Jesus going with God into the better future, into accomplishing salvation for all of us. Why? Because he was humble. And we see Jesus who believes the right things about God. You know why? Because in the garden, he's talking to him. It's really hard to believe the wrong things about God when you have a regular relationship with him, when you're regularly slowing down to spend time with him, when you take time out of your busy schedule to actually be with him. Jesus believes the right things about God. And we see that Jesus, throughout his entire life, is completely on board with the Father's mission. He says it over and over, I'm coming to do what the Father has sent me to do. And so as we